to avoid in designing your experiments. Now, Pascal talked about a wager about God. If it's true and you accept God, that's fabulous. If God is real and you reject him, that is super bad. On the other hand, if God does not exist and you assume he does, well, that's still a small win. You've probably lived a better life. But if God does not exist and you assume he doesn't, that's a zero. You don't gain anything by that. That was Pascal's wager, as they call it. He says, in his classic piece of work back in 1670, he said, let us assess the two cases. If you win everything. If you lose nothing. That's to him a slam dunk. That's an easy decision. Why not give up that which you cannot keep in order to gain that which you cannot lose? That's really the epistemological problem that's facing each one of us. Why now? Because I believe we're being plunged in a period. A more sure word of prophecy. Whereunto ye do well to take heed, as unto the light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts. What on earth did he mean? He was an eyewitness, and yet he says we have even something better. We have the more sure word of prophecy. What on earth is he talking about? Lord Kelvin, William Thompson, known as Lord Kelvin, made an interesting remark. He says, until we can measure a thing, we really know very little about it. That's what drives many scientists to really measure things, to really make sure we understand them. Well, can we measure confidence? I want to anchor our following discussion on simply one manuscript fact. The Hebrew scriptures that we call the Old Testament were translated into Greek by 270 BC. That's called the Septuagint version. We have many copies available in any bookstore. These Hebrew scriptures contain over 300 prophecies that detail their coming Messiah. 300 of them. And let's take a look at a few of these. That he was to be of the David's family. He would be born of a virgin. He'd be born in Bethlehem. He would sojourn in Egypt. He would live in Galilee. Each one of these are from the Old Testament in Nazareth. He'd be announced by an Elijah like herald. This would occasion the massacre of Bethlehem's children. It would proclaim a jubilee to the world. His mission would include the Gentiles. His ministry would be one of healing. He would teach through parables. He'd be disbelieved and rejected by the rulers. And it goes on. He would make a triumphal entry into Jerusalem riding a donkey. He would be betrayed by a friend for 30 pieces of silver. He would be like a smitten shepherd, be given vinegar and gall. They would cast lots for his garments. His side would be pierced. Not a bone would be broken. He would die among malefactors. His dying words were foretold. He'd be buried by a rich man. He would rise from the dead on the third day, and his resurrection would be followed by the destruction of Jerusalem. This is just a sampling of a list of 300. What I'd like to do in the brief time we have remaining is to examine just 8 of these and come to some conclusions about them. Just 8, and we're going to take the simplest ones. Let's take the first one. You've all read it on Christmas cards, if nothing else. Micah 5:2, but thou, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall he come forth unto me, that is to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. We could spend a whole hour just extracting the gems that are tucked away in this one verse, but we're going to extract just one fact. Where was the Messiah to be born? Obviously in Bethlehem. Question, what is the probability of any person taken at random over the last few thousand years of fulfilling this one? If the population of Bethlehem is less than 10,000 during that period of time, and if there's an average of, say, 1 billion people on the planet Earth, just picking that number out, if we divide that out, there's about one chance in 100,000 or less that a person that you pick at random is born in Bethlehem. Have any of you run into anyone in your travels that has been born in Bethlehem? Besides Jesus Christ. I'll set him aside. Okay. So I'm being generous by saying 1 in 100,000 is probably much more rare than that, but that's to serve our purpose. Let's take another one. Again from Zechariah. It says, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just and having salvation, lowly, riding upon an ass, and upon the colt, the foal of an ass. Zechariah 9:9. And obviously Jesus Christ went out of his way to fulfill this very specific one. But how many people the last several thousand years have presented themselves as a king to Jerusalem riding a donkey? Well, I don't know of any, but if I say less than 1 in 100, I'm being generous. I think so. Let's take another one. I said to them, if you think good, give me my price. If not, forbear. So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. Familiar verse to many of us. How many people have been betrayed for precisely that amount? 30 pieces of silver. Well, I don't know of many, but that's probably not hard to do. So I'm going to say the probability of someone being betrayed for that specific price is less than 1 in 1,000. I think I'm being generous. Okay? Number 4, the Lord said to me, cast it to the potter. A goodly price that I was prized out of him. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Now, this particular one may require a little more familiarity with the New Testament. You may recall that Judas, when he had betrayed Christ, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself, and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned in that I have betrayed the innocent blood. And they said, what's that to us? See thou to that. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went out and hanged himself. But then notice what happened next. The chief priests took the silver pieces and said, it is not lawful for to put them into the treasury, because it is the price of blood. That was against the law. So they're sitting there on the floor. They can't put it in the treasury, but they had good CPAs on staff. They took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. What you need to understand is the temple had the obligation, when someone died in the precincts that wasn't anyone responsible for, the temple had to deal with the burial. So they couldn't put the money in the treasury, but what they could do is prepay anticipated expenses. And so what they did with it, they bought a field that would be a cheap place to acquit themselves of this obligation. Wherefore that field is called the field of blood to this day. Now I want you to notice the particulars here. The price was 30 pieces of silver. The location of the transaction was in the house of the Lord, that is in the temple, right? And who ends up with the money? The potter, the guy that owned that field. So it's interesting, those conditions are all met from Zechariah's prophecy. If I say the probability of this happening as a random occurrence, I'd say it's less than 100,000. Less than, probably, you could say 1 in a million, but this will suit our purposes. There's another one in Zechariah that is personally touching to me. It says, one shall say unto him, what are these wounds in thine hands? And he shall answer, those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. When I first encountered this, in those days, I was a teenager and I was on a memory kick. So when I came across a prophetic thing, I'd type up a little card and put the verse on the one side and the reference on the other and try to learn it. I always carried a few of these as I tried to add to my repertoire. But as I tried to memorize this one, the more I tried, the more confused I got. Because I recognized that, it looked like prophecy at first, but I said, what are these wounds on the hands? Then he shall answer, are those with which I was wounded in the house of my friends. And the more I thought about it, that didn't make sense. I could not visualize a group of Roman soldiers driving spikes through wrists on a bunch of 12 by 12s or whatever as being in the house of his friends. That just didn't compute for me. But I was reading the Gospel of John once and said, but Thomas was not with him that first night. The resurrection day, he appeared to the disciples, but Thomas was not among them. And the next day or so, they ran into Thomas and said, boy, you should have been at the Bible study last night. Guess who showed up? And Thomas was skeptical, you may recall. He said to them, except I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and thrust my hand into his side, I will not believe. That was Thomas's response. Well, after 8 days again, the disciples were within, and this time Thomas was with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace be unto you. Then he said to Thomas, reach hither thy finger, behold my hands. Reach hither thy hand and thrust it into my side, and be not faithless, but believing. Thomas answered and said unto him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said unto him, Thomas, because thou hast seen me, thou hast believed. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed. What I realized, it wasn't the nails that wounded Christ, it was Thomas's unbelief. Well, nevertheless, getting back to Zechariah 13:6, how many people, taken at random, have been wounded in their hands in the house of their friends in whatever context? If I see less than 1 in 1,000, I think I'm being generous. Let's take another one here. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He's brought as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. Isaiah 53 is a chapter that details the crucifixion, even though it was written as a pillar passage in the Old Testament. How many people, prisoners, accused of a capital crime, make no defense even though they're innocent?